and welcome to another Watercolours with Caroline. This week we're going to paint the California coast, some beautiful surf, and the reference photo is by Denise McQuillan. So many thanks to Denise for all her beautiful photos and her permission to use them for my watercolours and for my classes. So we're going to paint an 8x10 this week. I'm using Arches cold press paper. Get your paper ready and your paints ready, and let's paint. The photographs, Denise McQuillan has absolutely beautiful photographs, and she's always so gracious when I write to her. She's just lovely. And these were her California surf ones, which I thought, there was another beautiful surf one from Vancouver Island's west coast, but it was a pretty complicated one, and I thought this might be a little easier. And I did this one on some, it's not my regular Arches paper, it's Kali paper. I think it's an Indian handmade paper, and I was a little dubious about how it would work out, but I didn't stretch it, I didn't tape it, I just used it in the book and it worked out okay. So I was quite pleased. I hope it works as well on the Arches paper that I've stretched for today. I'm a little nervous that it won't be as good. So we're going to start with the sky, just in a nice flat cerulean blue. And we're not going to wet the paper or anything because it's a very small piece. What we are going to wet is we're going to wet this little bit of surf here so that we can just bring the blue up to the wet edge. And if it bleeds in too much, we can push it back with the Kleenex. Kleenex is better than paper towel because it's much softer, but if you only have paper towel, then, you know, delicate touch is okay. I've put a lot of this in with the Dr. P.H. Martin's white, this surf afterwards, so don't worry too much if it doesn't work out for you. And we're going to do the same thing all the way along. We're going to wet the paper before we put the paint in, and then dab a little bit if we have any problems. I've also got a few soft brushes here. This is called a haki brush, goat hair haki brush, very soft. They're only $3 to $5, and I like just using these for brushing out like edges of the surf. This is another similar Chinese calligraphy brush, which is a soft goat hair too, and I'm not sure what this is made, but it's made in China as well, so it could be sheep hair or goat hair. They're all nice and soft for getting those brush soft edges if you want the soft surf. So we're going to try all of that, and let's put that where I can see it. So very basic start. Let's get my, it's recording, just making sure it's recording. Let's get my number 8 round brush to start, and some clean water, and where I want the surf, which is here, I'm just going to wet the edge of the surf that's going up into the sky. Now this is kind of like, I'm going to do this a little bit here too. This is just like making those fluffy blue clouds in the sky, you know, where you wet the paper, except this time we're just wetting the edge of the surf, and I'm taking it down a little bit into the surf because I don't want the blue to kind of come to a straight edge or anything there. Oh, I'm going to use Cerulean Blue, mainly because that's a nice different blue to the ocean and everything, and also because it's very easy to wash out as well. I've got my number 8 brush still. It's quite a small piece of paper that we're covering, and I want it liquid enough because I'm going on dry paper that I can get it across there without streaks or anything else happening. I want to mix up enough I can get across the sky, and just get my little bit of test paper and see how that looks. Let's compare it to this one. Looks all right to me. Okay, so either a 10, or you can use a flat brush, or a number 8. We want a brush that's big enough that we can get across here pretty quickly and easily, you know, with your horizontal brush strokes coming nice and close to your horizon line, nice and dipping into my paint. Now I'm coming up to that first splash where it's wet. Just kind of letting it come to the edge of that. I might leave, I've got a couple of dots there I haven't painted. I think I'll leave those for splashes. I might deliberately try and do that now as I'm coming across here to the wet surf. Dip in my paint again. And as I come up to this surf, I'm just coming up to the edge. Maybe leave some dots not painted up here. And go across the edge. Now I should get a nice soft edge to that surf. Let's zoom in a little bit. And if I don't get that edge to the surf, that's when I can use my Kleenex. If it's coming in too much, I can just push it back a little bit. Now don't overdo this, because if you overdo it, what you end up with is way too much paint taken off. It's just for that little bit of extra control. And I'm going to try one of my dry goat hair brushes. Just brush that wet edge just back into the blue, just so that I get that soft watery edge to the surf that's splashed up there. And notice I didn't go back over any of my brush strokes so that I didn't get any streaks. I just made sure I went over in one go. So you need a big enough brush for that, either your 8 or your 10, or a nice big flat brush. I just find round brushes easier to control for me, especially getting into the surf there. If it starts to seep down, just pick it up with your Kleenex and push it back. The more it dries, as it's getting dry, the easier it's going to be to control if you wanted to pick any up. And that's the beauty of Cerulean Blue. Not a staining color. It's easy to pick up, easy to wash back. So I'm just dabbing back a little bit more surf there. And of course the icing on the cake is when you come with a little bit of Dr. P.H. Martin's at the end, and you can splatter or dot on a little bit of extra white. Now we're going to leave that sky to dry, and I'll let you catch up, because the next thing we'll work on is the rocks while that sky is all drying. And we're going to do a similar thing when we get to the rocks. In some spots, such as here, where the surf is splashing over the rock, when we get to this part of rock painting, we're going to wet that surf edge, but don't wet it when we're starting over here, because it will be dry by the time we get back here. But when we get to about here, we're going to wet this surf edge and then do exactly like you did with the Cerulean Blue and come up to that wet edge and control it with your Kleenex. Now as we come down here, there is no surf over this edge, so it's nice and hard. So we don't have to have this little bit of surf here. So we can start the process here, go along with a harder edge, and then do the wet edge here. So I'll let you get your sky down. While you're doing your sky, I'm going to mix up my rock colours, and then I'll tell you what they are when you've got your sky in. I get my palette. I'm actually going to move my painting for a minute. I know I usually, for the video, do it right on top, but I don't want to get splashes today. I want to be a little bit more careful. Now the rocks are going to have to be quite dark compared to the white. That's what's going to make the white look so stark, is having good dark rocks. And of course the rocks could be done in 2 or 3 layers to get them dark. They don't need to be fussed with at all. The more texture you have on them, the more brush strokes, the more rocky they will look. And I usually, when I'm mixing a dark color like this, I also use whatever I've got in my mixing tray. It all adds to the beauty and the texture of the colors. Going to utilize the Kingfisher color or the boat color or something from last week. I think it was the ocean or the boat. By the way, I saw some of your boats and they look beautiful. Really beautiful. That's some rock colors in there. I'm gonna experiment. Okay. I wonder if that will be enough rock color. Sometimes it's deceptive how much you need. Always make a little bit more. There, I think I've got a good amount. So what this one was the first one was the Ultramarine Blue and the Burnt Sienna, my favorite brown mix always. The great thing is it's both of them are non-staining and easy to wash back. So if your rocks get too dark or you need to pull out some shape in the rocks, you can easily dab shape out, wash shape out, get the paint off. This is just some burnt sienna with a bit of whatever color was in there, so in case I want some lighter edges to the rock. And then for this one, I decided to experiment. I have this new color here, which is quinacridone burnt orange, I think it's called, which is something very close to burnt sienna, but a bit more orange. I tried that with the ultramarine blue, and I added some sepia to that for some darker edges to the rock, just experimenting how that new color mixed that I got. I think it behaves very much like burnt sienna, but I've forgotten whether it stains or not, so I can't remember. I'm going to put some here. This is it's beautiful. This is the quinacridone burnt orange, and next to it I'll put the burnt sienna. You can see they're fairly similar. It's just that the burnt orange is a little bit more orange. And it is possible it might be a staining colour. We'll try it later. So I've got my rock colours. And always have some clean water so that when you wet your surf, you're not wetting it with dirty water to put your edge on. I'm going to look at Denise's photo rather than my painting. Yeah, so there's a little bit splashing here. We'll start over on the left rocks, and I'm going to use a brush you rarely see me use. I've got a couple here. That's a flat square brush to get a sort of angular look to the rocks. And just see what that does. If I find it's not working for me, I'll switch back. I don't know which one to use. What I find is these ones I have don't hold as much water as my silver black velvets. So. Right, so we're going into some hard edges for the rocks here. I've grabbed my burnt sienna and ultramarine blue mix. I've got a good amount on my brush, and I want my rocks to look very angular. We can do any texture to the rocks later after they're dry. We can add more lines, we can scuff some of them out. Oh, I'm gonna grab just burnt sienna now. I just want a bit of a color change. Make sure that you always have a lot of paint on your brush. It's very hard to paint well without a good amount of paint on that brush. And the thing is, if your brush and your paint are nice and wet, it gives you a lot of working time. You can go back into your brush strokes for a bit. What I'm avoiding here, zoom in a little bit, there is a little bit of a rock pool in here between these rocks, and it's a rather nice white space break. I kind of like it. Now, if I'm painting along here, I'm not going right to the edge. If you paint like that, make sure that you have rock shape so that when you go back and fill the rest in, you're filling it in against a rock shape, not just an odd brush shape. Because I'm coming close to the point where I want to wet the surf. I want a little bit of white space in there, that little rock pool, and then I'm going to make sure I get a really clean brush, clean water, and the surf is sort of coming over the rock here. I'm just gonna wet here where the surf comes over. And I need my Kleenex handy because it's going too far into the surf there, so I need to be able to control that a little bit. And I might need to dampen the edge when that's calmed down a little bit. So I'm going to get a damp brush, and with my damp brush I'm going to just, no, it's bleeding back too much into the surf, so be careful of that. I'm finding I might just need to dab into the rock there to soften it. And grabbing all the time, grabbing more paint. Now the good thing is there are sort of rock piles in front of other rock piles here, so I'm going to kind of leave that rock pile unpainted and go back and paint some of these back here. I will get lines, but that's going to make texture. Now as it comes up against the surf, let's move my camera up a little bit. As it comes up against the surf down here, I'm going to use the edge of my brush to push it down into the surf here, so I get a jagged edge of surf. So I'm just turning my square brush on its side and pushing it down sideways there. And there's another little rock pool behind this one here. So I'm going to put this rock in because I'm going to put a rock pool behind it. And then work with this edge. There's also some little rocks sticking out of the surf here. The surf is kind of coming up the rocks here, leaving these kind of lines, angled lines. And some rocks in here. So as it comes down to the surf here, there's more disturbance happening. I want some bit more burnt sienna on my brush. A bit more texture coming up here. Like I said, it doesn't matter if you get odd lines in your damp paint here. It's all going to make texture in these rocks. So go slowly across so that you can work on them carefully, coming into the, you know, the shapes at the edge and the little rock pools. And at some point, even though I mixed up loads of paint, just mixing up a little bit more. Also, coming across here, there's a lot more texture too in this little area. So I want to get the big part in and then work on the little textures. I'm switching between colors. You don't need to always have the same color on your brush. A lot of little rocks showing through there. As I'm coming around this side, there's a lot of tiny rocks here, so I want to make sure I get all those little shapes in. It's the little breaths of white, the little white spaces that interest the eye and the viewer when those appear. It's so much more interesting than having just a flat bank of rocks going across there. I got a little rock pool back here. It doesn't matter if you don't make them exactly the same. Just as long as you keep most of your rock pools horizontal. If they're not a horizontal shape, they don't look like water. And around here, there's a whole bunch of little rocks. So again, I'm using the edge of my brush, the corner. Put a lot of those in. And they have quite a bit of surf splashing on them. So I'm going to leave a few little white bits here and there. And I know there's odd shapes in my brush strokes here. That doesn't matter. They're all going to be resolved once this is dry and I put some extra shade and some extra texture and a little bit of lifting and scrubbing out. It'll all be fine. I got to come across here. Now, the surf coming over here, I'm going to have another go. It's really difficult to get that wet edge, and probably this is one of the hardest parts to do, is get that wet edge without it going back into the surf too brown. So maybe I'll give it a bit of time to soak in just here before I attempt that. And you have to have your brown mix quite thick, not too watery. I'm going to leave that bit, I've wetted it up, I'm going to leave it for a moment and work back here where it's not wet. And then come to that when it's soaked in a little bit. This is drying up a little bit, so I'm just putting a little bit of extra dark on some of this. And then I want my mix to be quite thick and dry, because that's the key. If you've got drier mix, it doesn't spread as much out into the wet. And I want to attempt that bit here where it's coming up to the paper I wet. I probably let my paper dry too much now. If you're struggling with this, don't worry, I'm struggling too. It's not an easy thing to do. I didn't get a very soft edge, but I'll try and make a soft edge with a wet brush. I was being too cautious this time. And like I said, when I did this one here on this cheap paper, I wasn't even fussing, because I thought this is just my first attempt on cheap paper. I'm not going to fuss, and sometimes that's much easier than trying to be very careful and get it right. But I'm going to get my smaller wet brush. I'm going to my number 4 and my Kleenex ready. I'm going to try and soften that surf edge here. Kind of push. That's going to work. There we go. I've got quite thick brown mix. Let me zoom in a little bit. I've got quite thick brown mix there, and I've got a little bit of water on my brush, not a lot. And what I'm doing is I'm pushing my brush down into that rock. That's working well. And as I'm pushing it down, I'm getting that soft edge. It's a little bit dirty, but I've just put some clean water on it and cleaned it up a little bit. And I'll push it down a little bit more. Now the key is to have the brown not too wet, still damp, not too wet, and your brush not too wet, and so that the water pushes towards the paint and not the other direction. And you can see that it's difficult for me, so it's not an easy thing to achieve. And then I'll use my Kleenex to help me. And I think I've achieved that soft edge there. Now I can go back to this one that's almost dry, where I didn't get a very good soft edge, and I can try that same technique, push back a little. Because remember, these are not staining colors. And I'm going to just push into them a little bit with my damp brush and dab, and that again is going to give me a bit of a soft edge there where the surf comes down. So that, sorry to not have it perfect, but honestly I can't even remember how I achieved the looks, and sometimes it's always just trial and error even when you're painting it again. But that's a good method. Now I don't want to overdo it, I just want to get a few soft edges. Let's pull back a little bit. And I have a few rocks in the foreground here, and I'm going to use my round brush for those. I'm going to use my round number 6. I want a bit more control with these ones down here. So I'll get some more nice dark paint. And what these do is, I like the corners and the borders to have something in them to arrest the eye from going out of the painting, and to balance. Like, we've got a huge bank of dark rocks in the middle, and we just want a little bit of balance here. So I'm putting the rocks at the edge of the picture, and I'm not going to worry too much about having surf coming over those or anything. I can always take a little bit out when the whole painting's dry if I want to get a little bit of soft edge. And that's the thing too, if you didn't achieve any of those soft edges, and don't worry, it's very hard to do, you can wait till the whole thing is dry and scrub some out then. That will work. Don't worry, it will work fine. I'm going to add a couple of little rocks where there aren't any in the photo. And there's just a little bit here. Add a few little ones in the surf here. A bit more texture on the rocks. Now, some painters scrub out the rocks with a credit card, and I've watched some of them struggle to demonstrate that, and it doesn't always go well for them. Never have I been able to achieve that, and I don't like it because it's okay if it's your last thing, but it damages your paper, so you can't really go back and put much detail on afterwards because your paper is scraped up and damaged. So I prefer to do the whole thing with a paintbrush and don't rely on little tricks like credit cards and things like that. And I'm putting a little bit of extra rock just over here. And another thing I want to do is where the surf is coming up these rocks. Let's look at the photo over here. I want to dilute my brown and just put a bit of brown shadow along here. We're going to put the greeny shadow too. But if you notice, there's a little bit of brown shadow over this. So I've got to dilute this mix so it's not really, really dark. And then I'm going to dilute it even more than that. And put some of these lighter, much lighter brown shadows in the direction, in this kind of sweeping up direction of the waves coming up over these rocks here. And we're going to do a lot also with the greeny colour. I got a little bit of shadow there, and another place is over here where there's a lot of disturbance in the surface. It comes up to these rocks. I'm going to put some browny coloured shadows in here too. Let's pull back. Now I know all this looked a bit of a mess at the start, but I promise you, once I get another layer of dark and some lines and cracks in those rocks and a little bit of dark down here, it's going to look absolutely fine. And so if you have any weird lines that happened or backgrounds, don't worry about it. It's all going to be fine when you get some more colour in. One thing I tried with this one, which I decided not to do in the end, but on my first layer I laid some crinkled up saran wrap over the rocks to get some texture, and it worked okay, but I think just using a paintbrush is better. It seemed like a lot of fuss for not much outcome, and also then we have to sit and wait for 20 minutes for the plastic wrap to dry, and that's a bit of a waste of time when we're on the clock, so to speak. Anyway, I'll let you catch up with your rocks, because I'm sure you're still painting away, and I'll My sky's dry. So the next thing we'll be doing when your rocks are all done, we're going to put the background ocean in, and that is going to be a challenge because we're going to get lots of that wet surf against the background ocean. So we're going to have to work with this little technique than I did down here on a much bigger scale. Unhelpful that way. So what I'm going to do is I've got a very clean number 10 brush, just so my brush is completely clean. Clean water, and I'm going to wet those. Wet those edges of the surf. Imagine they're clouds, you know, when you make clouds in the sky. And here. So my surf's going to be wet all up this edge. And I also want a dry edge there, so I've got a crisper edge. Right, that's all wetted up. I'm going to start with just ultramarine blue. I think I'll go back to my number 8 brush and keep my 10 nice and clean for wetting. So I'm going to get some ultramarine blue, wash. I'm going to make sure it's not too dark. It's okay, you know what? I don't know if I did this on the original, but I want to add a little bit of phthalo blue to that. Remember last week when we did our ocean behind the boat? I think it made it look a bit more bright. Yeah, I've just added, I've added a little bit of phthalo blue to the ultramarine to brighten it up a little bit. And I think that works for me for making it more of an ocean color. We'll see. Again, if you're doing the ocean, you need to have a good horizontal stroke and come along the horizon nice and straight. Dip your brush frequently, and now I'm coming up to the surf. Probably didn't wet it enough this time. Yeah, I probably didn't wet it enough. I'm going to have to, with now dirty water, of course, wet it a little bit more. Yeah, it's softening in. And I'm going to have to use my Kleenex to make sure I soften that up. Soften that edge. With a clean brush. Clean brush. I still need to wet that a little bit more. Too cautious. Yeah, see now I've wet it too much. It's a real, really difficult thing to judge how much wet to put there. Because too much and it floods in, too little and it does nothing. So that's why you've got to have your Kleenex in your hand. Now I've got my number 6 brush with nice clean water on, and I'm going to use that to do like I did on the rocks, which is push back into some of that blue with a clean damp brush. I'm even going to try this one, sweeping. I got a dry brush, sweeping back into the, again, brush that's clean, pushing back into that, yeah, it's working, pushing back into that wet paint, and then Kleenex, push with the Kleenex, soften up here, dab. I'm going to push, yeah, I'm just pushing upwards with my Kleenex. Grab one of these, Hake brush, push upwards with that. And it's hard work. It's sort of, you have to go in both directions, pushing back and painting in a bit more water. The good thing is ultramarine blue is highly liftable, so we can get those nice soft edges on the surf. And once it's dry, we can soften them up again. There's no problem with that. There's a little bit of ocean behind here that I want to put in. So again, I'm wetting that edge. It's a smaller piece, so I might have more success with this piece. Not guaranteed, of course, but let's put the ocean in here. And I'm going to have a hard edge on this side. That's okay. So I'll zoom in. The hard edge here is where I can introduce a lot of the splatter and spray by putting on the dry paper those little dots around the edge here. And it's coming a little bit much here, so again I'm just going to shove it back with my Kleenex. And shove it back there. And that's working okay. We've got a nice variety of hard edges and soft edges and spray. Put some spray up here. And of course we're going to put a lot more on in the center of the wave. I'm putting a little bit of that spray on with the blue and then wetting it out so that it's not as harsh. I could do that with this a little bit, just a little bit of wet to soften the shadows a little bit. And then I have this side here to do. Oh, I want the whole edge down here soft, and then the rest of the edge a lot harder. So I'm going to start with the hard edge here, Again, if I'm going to stop my painting line, I'm going to stop it in a horizontal line so that I can come back to it and have an ocean shape there. And now I'm getting into the wet area. Just controlling that. I don't know which brush I'm using. I've got two brushes, one for the wet and one for the paint, and they are all confused about what they're doing. So I'm going up against the wet edge now. I'll take my soft brush. And also my Kleenex. Just got a bit of a soft edge on there. So I know it's pretty tough, isn't it? This is probably one of the hardest things that we will do, is trying to get these soft edges on the surf. While that's all drying, I will work on this edge here. So you catch up with me. Don't rush your surf, and just remember that you can, after this is dry, because it's ultramarine blue, you can scrub out any surf that you don't, you know, that got out of hand. For instance, I'm going back here to where it's fairly dry, and if I wanted to soften this edge, I've got my little scrubbing out brush. I'm just going to use some clean water and push that edge out, dab it with my Kleenex and soften up this edge. I can even like take out a little bit of surf from behind that. So all is not lost if you find that you've got no soft edges at all. You can get them back. And then I will mix up some colour for all of this interesting stuff in the foreground. I've been pretty loose and loosey-goosey with that. I haven't been too... It's actually amazing when the whole painting was loosey-goosey, just a tryout to see what would happen. And the whole thing, when you look at the whole thing when it's finished, it looks all right. But if you examine any one little bit of it, it looks like a mess. Yeah, right. Well, right, I'm going to see what my foreground waves are. They're Ultramarine Blue, Phthalo Blue, and Phthalo Green. So what I've mixed already, the Ultramarine Blue and Phthalo Blue and a bit of Phthalo Green, and then of course a lot of water to make it a much lighter mix. I got a clean Kleenex because my Kleenex is getting very blue. And I'll use what paint I've got there and add to that, add a bit more Phthalo Blue and some Phthalo Green. The reason we've used a lot of Phthalo Green this last few weeks is it's a great colour for water. The transparency of it is like the transparency of water, and it makes that lovely sort of light green colour with the, you know, if you mix it with blue, with touches of blue, and it's just really lovely for all kinds of water. So I've mixed the Phthalo Blue, Phthalo Green and that Ultramarine Blue, and I've put a lot of water with it, because I want it really, really light. I might even add a little bit more water. So what I'm looking at is all this disturbance in the surf here, which is quite greeny, sometimes a little bit ultramarine in some of the shadows, but we can start with the greeny colour when you're ready. And of course we're going to be using that colour again in here inside the waves. So there's not actually many mixes for this one. There's not many colours either. I hope you do notice how beautifully flat my paper's staying no matter how much water I use on it. I just love having, it's such a long time since I've bothered to stretch my paper and have a nice piece of flat stretch paper, and it's just a joy to have it stay flat while I'm painting, because I'm right-handed and that's just an easy place to start. And I really do think for me the number 8 brush is a good choice, because I don't want to get too detailed with this. Just remember the motion of the ocean, you know. I know that rhymes. It's lifting up over the rocks here. So when I'm painting these shapes, I'm keeping that in mind, that this is kind of lifting up over these rocks. It's kind of rolling in like this, or rolling back. I guess the waves come over and then the water is rolling back. So what I want to do most of all is sweep my brush in that direction. Put a little bit, I don't want to cover up all of that white in there, but I just want to put a little indication of that greeny colour, so it doesn't look too much like just a weird place that I haven't painted. I'm sort of looking at my reference photo for a little bit of direction, but I also want to use a little bit of my freedom of expression to make my waves how I want to make them. I'm leaving this corner a little bit because it's a little bit more ultramarine blue, and I might add a little bit more ultramarine blue to that. And I'm going to add a bit more water to some of my wash so that it lightens up as it comes over here. Remember, if it's got the Phthalo Green and the Phthalo Blue in, it's going to be more intense. So there's a lot of disturbance around the rocks. Now I've got that far, I want to go, it's gone a little bit abstract, hasn't it? That's okay. I want to go a little bit more ultramarine-y. I'm going to get some, over here I have the place where I mix my ultramarine and Phthalo Blue. So I'm diluting that right down because this is very light at the front of the ocean here. Very, very light, so lots and lots of water. And this is not as green as the mix I have here. More water. Oh, it's surprising how much water you need. I bring this over. This is just like diluted right out to almost looks like the water I have in my brush washing pot. So I want to just have some of that surf that's a slightly different color here. It's very bubbly. Fill up the corner. I don't like the corners unfilled. I call them eye stoppers. A little bit more blue there, and the same blue, this shadow from these rocks here. I'm going to take that out there. A little bit in here. Don't forget to leave some white. And shadow from these rocks here. And then some of that kind of like disturbed water. And it is more over this side. I'll move over. Over this side it's a little bit more disturbed, so I'm going to have a different, slightly different wave pattern. And washing my brush, I'm just going to go back to the greeny mix. And sometimes what you want to do is when you have a lot of chippy choppy brush strokes like I had there, you want to have a relief for the eye in that you have some just plain wash strokes, no disturbance in your brush strokes, so that your eye has a little bit of a rest from all that chippy choppy wave stuff going on. Oh, I'm going to look at this one. See, this one had hardly anything on it. I kind of like that, so I don't want to. Oh, I don't want to overdo. I don't want to overdo this. I might, when this is dry, put just a little bit of dark in a few places, and of course it will dry slightly lighter. But I'll let you do that. And keep a hold of this colour that you've made for these waves down here, because you're going to use that on the surf. Like I'm going to use a little bit. I'm going to put a little bit there in the surf, and then use my wet brush to just make that into a little shadow. Zoom in. I don't know if you can see that. It's not even really in the photo, but I did it in my painting and I kind of liked it. I just put a little bit of that greeny blue colour in here, and then with a clean damp brush I sort of scrubbed it into the surf, just to give it a little bit of shadow as it comes over the rock. You can definitely see that happening here in the picture. Sorry to rush ahead. I find it impossible once I've got a paintbrush in my hand and some paint in my palette. It's like I don't want to stop painting. It's so hard. I'm going to put that in there. It's so hard to stop and wait for you. And I'm putting a little bit of that shadow in there. Wet brush, just dry it off a little bit, and I'm scrubbing. I'm scrubbing with that brush to get a rough edge on that shadow in there. And once I've done that, once I've got that rough edge, I can even add just a little bit more along the edge. And then I can add a ton of water to my brown. Maybe add, let's bring it over here. I got that brown from the rocks here. Add a little bit of the blue and a load of water in there. And I'm going to still do a little bit of, that's made a nice sort of bluey grey colour. So I'm going to do a little bit more shadow coming up here onto the rocks. And in here. And just kind of, you know, where there's all this surf here, I've mixed the brown with the blue, and just adding a bit more. Mine's kind of dry, getting quite dry now, so I'm just adding a bit more texture to these wave areas. A little bit of because there are some little dark areas in there. But again, I don't want to overdo it. I have to be really careful. What I like about this picture is a lot of the white that's in it. Yeah, that's enough. Don't fiddle with it too much. It's a big temptation, but just finishing up. I'm going to get some Phthalo Green on its own. And then this mix that I used for the waves at the front, which was the Phthalo Green and the Phthalo Blue and a little bit of Ultramarine. And I also want some Phthalo Blue for some of the darker parts, the warmer blue parts. And make sure you've got some clean water for softening the edges of your waves. I'm going to, what number brush am I going to use? Is 10 going to be too big? I don't think so. I think I want to stick with the number 10 so I don't get too small with my brush strokes. It's going to be quite a process because we're going to have to work across this, you know, doing wet in wet and some softening and wet in wet and some softening. So it is going to be kind of tricky. And I'm going to use my number 10 brush. And I want to start, I'm going to start in here. I'm going to start with a little bit of ultramarine blue in there, up against this rock here. And quite light, and then I want to switch to the, I'm going to put a little bit of the just Phthalo Green in there, and then I'm going to switch to the green and blue mix. And I'm holding my breath because it's you never know what's going to happen. And I'm going to come down here now. I want to, the wave comes up over here, so I want to kind of try and get this part in one before I start to do a bit of softening. I'm switching back and forth. I'm going over to the ultramarine blue now. I had a bit of the mix, and it kind of comes up here. And of course I can't do the exact shape that I just outlined, but it's in my head. I'm trying to think about that shape. And I'm hoping that I've got all of this in wet enough that I can still manipulate all of that with a wet brush. I've got it all in wet and clean water. I'm going to go to, I think my number 8 brush. I don't want to go too small with a brush. And I'm going to start just here, just pushing back into, let's zoom in a bit. I've got a clean wet brush and I'm pushing it back into that colour. Now you don't want to wait too long. I know my paint's fairly wet. I don't want to wait too long before I start wetting those edges, or they're not going to be soft. So let's wet those in and come down here, wet those in, push down into the mix and push down into the mix here. I got my Kleenex so I can control that. Now, you want to get to this before your paint dries too much. And the sheet over here, push back into it. And it's still wet, so you can still work on it. I'm going to dab some paint in, and where it's all wet, it's going to just sort of flood in. But if you've pushed back in with just a damp brush, it's going to have a lovely soft flooding back in. I'm just going into the Ultramarine Blue. Everything's very watery. I'm starting to add a little bit of shadow. Now I know I'm working fast, but I can't work slow at this point, but I will slow down in a second and wait for you. I just want to get in some of those while this is wet. I've got Ultramarine Blue on my brush. While this is wet, I have to get a bit more shadow in here. So I'm starting to add either Ultramarine Blue or the mixture of Ultramarine and Phthalo and Phthalo Blue and Phthalo Green. And I want to get some of those really darker spots in. And the good thing is if everything's still wet, it's going to mix in nice and softly. Take a little bit of Phthalo Green and just drop that in. And make sure if there's anything that's not soft, I'm going to go back and soften it up again. I'm going to grab some Ultramarine Blue. This might be drying up too much to get that in there. But I'll work on having a bit of a hard edge to the wave just there. Wet brush, like your wet brush is your friend. Get your wet brush and I've got a tiny bit of paint on it. Clean wet brush. And I'm going to keep on working on softening any of these edges for as long as they're a little bit wet. And I'm literally using my brush almost like a scrubbing brush, laying it flat and pushing on it. Grab a little bit of blue on my brush so I've got a little bit of shading in that pushing that I'm doing. I know it's probably not good for your brushes, but honestly it's the only way to get some proper texture in there. And these silver black velvet brushes, they seem to take quite a lot of scrubbing and punishment. They're really good. Had them a long time. Oops, I got some waves going up here where I don't want them. So just work with your wave. Just keep doing what I've just been doing. I'm getting a little tiny bit, I don't know how to explain a tiny bit. Okay, so I've just, on the side of this here, I'm just getting like this much paint on my brush. And then I have a sponge and I'm rubbing a little bit of that off. And maybe even dabbing a bit of that off on my disgustingly dirty piece of Kleenex now. And then that might even be too much. I'm going to have to wash a bit of that off even. And then I'm going to use this like a scrubbing brush. I'm going to shove it down on its side and scrub with it on the paper. I'm going to come in a little bit more so you can maybe see me do that. Tiny bit of paint on the brush, dab a bit off on something, lay the brush on its side, and then scrub it on the dry paper, and you should get a rough edge to make just make a little bit of shadow in the surf. And the same if you have any, like I've got a bit of a rough edge here. Again, I'm going to use that poor little brush. It's a bit of a scrubbing brush and scrub into the surf. I got a bit more colour up there, which doesn't matter because if you look up here, there's a little bit more colour there. So let me try grabbing a little bit more colour on my brush. And try, don't need much. Oh my goodness, there's hardly any colour on my brush and I've got quite a bit there. But I'll take even more off. But you can see if I scrub in the direction of that shadow, I'm going to get that look. I'm going to get a little bit of blue on the tip of my brush because there's a deeper shadow in here. And just pop that in. This shadow kind of comes up like this. I've got at the moment just ultramarine blue on the tip of my brush, and I'm putting in a little bit more shadow coming up here and around here. But I want to, got that on there now, and I want to sort of scrub with my brush to soften that shadow up a little bit. Now I'm pretty fussy about my brushes, and I promise you it's not going to hurt it very much. It's not distressing my brush too much, but I am getting a good sort of soft scrubby look happening. I want to have a bit up here too. So I've got just a little bit more ultramarine blue on my brush. It's very, very dry, really dry. And I'm going to scrub in some shadow in the underside of this wave here. I'm going to get some green on my brush now. And do some shadow under this one. Maybe some blue and green. It's quite dark in this corner. And again, up where you come up to edges and corners, it's really good to have a bit of dark. Of course, I've got ultramarine blue again in here. I'm going to bring it up to the shape that's been made by everything here. By me, you know, pushing back with the wet brush and the wet in wet. Dry my brush off on this little disgusting bit of Kleenex. And take that dark mixture I've just put on there and scrub that in so that it's not so harsh. Don't lose all the white though. You've still got to have, let's pull back a little bit. You've still got to have some white going on in your waves, even if you're putting in a little bit of this shading. Now, just coming up from the rock here, it's more of a brown shading, so I'm going to get a little bit of burnt sienna and the bluey color and a little bit more burnt sienna. I know you can't see me doing that, sorry, it's way over here. So I got some burnt sienna, a little bit of the blue color I mixed, a little bit more burnt sienna. It's quite a warm little shadow coming off the rock. Water. And that's on my brush, but I've got to clean it off my brush. So my brush is stained now, just a stained dry brush. And with that, probably taken too much off. With that stained dry brush, I'm just going to add that brownie, that warm sort of brownie shadow coming up from the rock. My brush is really, really dry. I can't emphasize how dry it is. Just a little touch there. And pull back again so you can see it more as a full painting. Now I want a little bit more white here, so I've got a very clean brush and I'm going to lift out a little bit more white there. Might be time to get a clean Kleenex. I want a little bit more white here. And of course, at any time you can do that. The Phthalo Green won't lift out as well as the Ultramarine Blue, but you can still get back some very light surf. I've lost a bit of this white surf lifting up here, so let's aggressively try and scrub a bit out. There, I think, and again, it's not as dark as the photograph. I don't think I want to go that dark. If I look at it tomorrow when it's dry and I want to add a bit more dark, that will be a good time, but I'll have to do the same sort of effects again, putting the wet in and lifting it off of the damp edge with a damp brush. And I might just put a little bit more dark waves here, just for a little bit of balance. And I probably want to do some dark waves in the background now. Like I said, my one experimental one, I did quite a phthalo green wave. Now I'm going to do a different one for this one, just to test it out. Now, I said earlier that this colour looked ultramarine blue plus burnt sienna, my two favourites, maybe with a tiny bit of phthalo green added in. So let's try that. We have a mix here that's phthalo green, ultramarine blue and phthalo blue. So we can start with that and add a bit of more ultramarine. Oh, that's rather a lot, Caroline. But yeah, I'll just go with it. Add some burnt sienna. And a little bit more burnt sienna. And then let's try that out. See what that looks like over the top of ultramarine blue. What do I think? Do I think I need a tiny bit more phthalo green, possibly? I put a lot of ultramarine blue in, remember, it really was very thick. A little bit more ultramarine blue. Well, possibly. Let's give it a go. Big brush. Well, I've got number 8 brush with the paint on. I probably should be in a number 10, but that's okay. I'm going to put some waves back here. Dry paper. What I want happening up here, of course, is the waves have got to come up to the surf here, so I've got to wet the surf a little bit. As the waves go back into the landscape, they will be thinner. I took a bit of paint off my brush, and I'm trying to thin out the lines a little bit back there. They're a little bit darker as they come closer. Quite choppy. And decide how to. I'm going to do that whole thing with the surf again. Coming into the edge of the surf here with that greeny colour. And get my small wet brush. And I think I want a lot of control here. I don't want it to get away from me, so I've got my small wet brush to push back into that green, those green waves that I've made. That's where I'm getting a little bit of definition on the edge of these ones here. So I'm doing the same technique that I did over here on the rocks, where I'm putting the dark green in, and then I'm using a wet brush to push back into the dark green from the waves. And over on this side, there is quite a bit of dark. I'm working on dry paper, and my surf is dry. Going into the edge of my surf with the paint, which I'm going to model with my wet brush. I got a smaller brush, my number 4. Yep. Clean water, and I'm going to model where all of that surf hits that wave, those dark waves. Put a little bit of dark down there. And just getting in small brush now for little details. I don't want too much detail in the waves. I want it to be quite it's quite, subtle. I do have that bump in the paper there that I did want to kind of disguise with my wave pattern. And there's some shadow from the rocks that looks very phthalo bluish in the photograph. I rather like that look, so I'm taking some phthalo blue and I'm adding a bit more phthalo blue shadow to those rocks, because it looks rather lovely in the photograph that it's pretty strong. I'm seeing if it's... all I've got on my brush right now is phthalo blue, because I just wanted to get those lovely shadows in. I think those colours like the Phthalo Green and the Phthalo Blue just give it so much luminosity. Now, there's only one more thing to think about, and that's maybe a little bit of texture on the rocks. And there's a couple of ways to do that. You can either do it with a thin brush and put sort of lines in, or you can do it with a dry brush, put some texture in. So let's show both methods. I know I'm probably rushing way ahead of you, but I'm aware it's 4 o'clock and I want to at least do that, and then we can chat and you can catch up. And so I'm getting my Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna in a really, really dark mix. If you want it even darker, you can add Payne's Grey. You can add, I have Sepia here. Those are 2 nice dark colours. The reason I use the Ultramarine Blue and burnt sienna is you can scrub them back, you can take them off. They're not staining colours. They're great. So I've got those. Now I have a little number 2 brush here. So what I could do is I could have a lot of texture with a small brush if I wanted. It's using that dark mix. I have my Kleenex here in case they get out of control. So what you can sometimes do is whatever lines have happened with your painting, you can follow them and you can use them as your texture lines, or you can just follow the photograph, the reference photo, whatever works for you, whatever you want to do. Most of the time I don't put my fingers on the paper, but I know this is the last steps of my painting. I probably won't be doing any more to it, and that's a time when I don't worry too much about using my finger to sort of blend the paint a little bit. I've seen loads of other artists do that. I'm getting all that cragginess in the rock with that dark paint. So you can use little lines if you want to. This is a small brush. Especially if you are, like I'm looking back here at these areas where there's a rock pool and they're behind this rock. So you might want to use a little brush for little areas like this, definitely. And I'm sort of darkening the area behind the foreground rocks. And the other method you can use is a dry brush. So I've got my number 8 brush and I'm loading it up with the dark brown paint, and I'm doing what I did with the surf. I'm taking some of that paint off, not as much as with the surf because I want it a little bit darker. I'm laying it sideways on the paper and I'm going to scrub with it. And you can have a bit more paint on your brush. I'm just putting a bit more on. And I'm just going to scrub on those rocks until that paint's nearly run out of the brush. And again, you're going to get some lovely texture doing that. These rocks kind of go behind here. It's nice if you can get some dark going behind some lighter rocks, so that you can sort of form the separate rocks that way. Although you can't really see much separation on the photograph, you can give a little bit more. So I'm just scrubbing with that brush, getting some dark down in there. And I'll switch back to my little brush and I can start to add some little detail. I can scrub with a little brush too. It's kind of nice for that as well. And of course the ones in the background don't need anywhere near as much done to them. I'm lifting a little bit too much out there. I'll put some back in. Really don't need much more, otherwise they're going to get way too complicated. Maybe just a little bit more shadow behind those ones. little bit more dark on these ones, especially coming up to the surf there. Sometimes kind of nice to have the dark right up against the light. I'll pull back a bit. And of course where I came to the surf here is a little bit harsh, so I'm just going to soften that up just a little bit. But it's not quite so such a hard line. There, and mine's pretty much done. And I don't know how you are doing, and I hope you're doing okay. And I know this was a difficult one, so don't despair. Don't forget that I struggle too. I struggle to remember what I did. I struggle to get the same effect twice. It's always going to be a bit of a struggle. And you learn each time you do something, you learn something different, or it doesn't work the second time you try. Oh, I know what I haven't done. Just one more little thing that I can do is my lovely white paint. My lovely Dr. P.H. Martin's white, which I love. I'm going to get some of that, nice and fresh. I've got a little bowl here. I just mix it to the right consistency because it's very thick in the jar, and I've had mine several years, so it thickens up. I add a bit more water from time to time. And so what I want to do with the white is add just those little hard flecks of surf. Let's come in a little tighter. So as the surf is sort of splashing up, I'm going to use just the tip of my small brush to put some of that on. And if there's any places that need a bit more in the, like here, I lost a bit of the white here, I can put a bit more on. And if I want to, I can scrub it in with a soft brush if it's a little bit too harsh. So I put a little bit on, use a soft brush, and scrub that in. Some of the white is coming down into this darker surf that we put on. So I'm going to have a little bit of that, a bit splashing out here. And I'm working now with a little bit, just getting a little bit more splash and texture. Anywhere that I want it, anywhere that I feel. On the rocks, if I feel like I need a little bit more surf coming up the rocks. I haven't got that looking correct. If I've lost a little bit of rock pool anywhere. You know, if you lost a bit of your rock pool back here, there was another little one there which I lost a little bit of. I think there's a bit coming back here. I can form a little bit more rock by doing that. So you can play for a while. Again, another useful tool is your finger when you're doing this, because it softens the edges just nicely. So for instance, I would like some surf splashing up here, and I know that my brush is going to make harsh lines. I'm going to put that on there, and then I'm going to smudge that with my finger so it's a bit softer and not so harsh. Or I could use a soft brush. And it just gives it that lovely finishing touch. Some coming up here. Lost a bit of the white coming up here. Lost quite a bit actually. Put some in and smudge it with my finger. even back here in the ocean, there's surf in the waves back here. I can put that in. The key is to be very careful with it, not to put dots of white that are too big or too unnatural. You know, soften some of it out with a soft brush or your finger. And try and sort of follow the shapes that you see in the photo, because they will guide you. And that gives it just a little bit more movement. There's quite a lot of very, very dotty surf here. I'm gonna. It's a good time to use a splatter method. I don't want to splatter everything, so I'm gonna make sure I cover a few things. And then I'm going to get, let's see what good size brush, try number 8. I don't want to get carried away with the splatter, but it might help get some very natural looking surf edge. Right, practice on a piece of paper first. I tap it hard on my finger. It looks all right. Oh, that's going to be great. Look at that. Now I don't want it everywhere, so I've covered up places where I don't want it. And I always have my brush on a diagonal. It seems to work way better. But I've just put a little bit of that splatter on the edge of that wave there. And also I'm going to have some up the top here. Oh, great. There, and I protected the rest of it, but that's just given some natural splatter. It's very hard to do natural splatter with your tip of your brush. I do have quite a lot of white on this brush. I'm going to use a bit of it just to put some nice strong white here. There. And I think less is more. Don't overdo it, she says, and you'll never get me to put my paintbrush down until I forcibly put them away. Right, stop now. There, I think that is done. It's complete. It's got the surf, it's got the splatter, it's got the luminous sort of inside to the wave. I've got the texture on the rocks, and texture is always good to do the next day too, when the rocks are completely dry. It's sometimes easier and you can sort of see what you want. I don't want too much in this foreground area. I want it to be very white, so I'm pretty happy, but I struggled. I really struggled. Please know that if you're struggling, I am too. It's even harder to struggle when you know everybody's watching you and you've got to do it right. Then I'm not watching you. I can't see what you're doing, so it's not quite as stressful. But I was feel like I've got to make more of an effort than when I just do it by myself, which always makes it harder. Anyway, I'm going to take I like to protect, I don't know if any of you have tried the tape, but I really like to protect my brown tape with the masking tape. It also gives me an edge to my painting that I can put behind the mat in the frame. I won't take the brown tape off until tomorrow. I won't, because otherwise the paper will curl up because it will still be damp. But it's completely flat. Oh boy, it's nice to have completely flat paper. So I will leave it on till tomorrow, and then I will use a knife to just, the edge of the paper's right, where's my pencil? The edge of the paper is right here. I can see it. And tomorrow I'm just going to take a craft knife and cut that off when it's nice and dry, and it'll be nice and flat. So I'm sorry, but next week's going to be our last one, our number 8 lesson, and that will be the watermill and the rhododendrons, and that is the hardest one for me. So again, I'll be struggling. So I have every sympathy if you're finding it a struggle. That's Thank you for joining me again. I hope you enjoyed painting this lovely picture of the surf. I certainly did. I struggled, and I know I told you I struggled as I was painting it, and it was the second time I'd painted it, but somehow that just makes it more interesting, and I learn something every time I paint. So I hope you did too. Thanks for joining me. See you again next week. Bye now.